Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Robert Fuentes, President and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation. And I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar on our new report being released today, Time for Reform, Delivering Modern Air Traffic Control. And joining me here is Rui Nueva, the policy analyst here at Eno, who's literally written the book on air traffic control reform, and Jeff Davis, a senior fellow with Eno and the editor for Eno Transportation Weekly. Eno is an independent, nonpartisan think tank and has been deeply involved in this issue of ATC reform for a number of years, and this report builds on all of that work. It was highly informed by the experts on the Aviation Working Group, which is an advisory body here at Eno focusing on all matters related to aviation policy. It's chaired by former Transportation Secretary Jim Burnley and former Senator Byron Dorgan. The group is made up of diverse stakeholders with airlines, labor unions, including both pilots and controllers, business and general aviation experts, and academics. They provide Eno with insights and perspectives for how to approach some of the most challenging aviation problems of today. In 2013, this group was working to figure out how to accelerate the deployment of next-generation air traffic control. NextGen is a long-term initiative focused on transforming the current ground-based radar air traffic control system to one based on satellite navigation, automated position reporting, and digital communications. A report issued at the tail end of the Obama administration found that this investment would yield significant economic benefits by increasing the reliability of the system, leading to faster and more efficient travel for passengers and cargo. It would also allow the aviation system to grow to meet the demands of the global economy. However, funding shortfalls and institutional concerns at the Federal Aviation Administration have greatly hindered implementation. And our working group found that accelerating deployment of NextGen really needed institutional reform. So in this report, we make three main recommendations. First is that air traffic control should be spun off from the FAA, either to a new government corporation or an independent nonprofit organization should be chosen as the provider. Second is that stakeholders would be represented in a governing board of the new entity. The federal government always have a role in the governance structure as a guarantor of public interest. And third is that the new system, which is currently funded based on a mix of taxes and general revenues, be self-funded through user fees and be able to issue bonds for its long-term investment needs. So this current report builds on that work by putting it in the context of the current discussion around air traffic control reform today. First is the political uncertainty and the instability in the federal budget, including the sequester and the government shutdown. These issues are disruptive for flight schedules, potentially harmful for safety, and threaten our ability to maintain fully staffed and trained workforces. Another is that in 2016, a bill to spin off air traffic control provision into a new, independent, nonprofit entity was introduced in the House of Representatives. Though it was not enacted, it greatly amplified the issue and will likely be up for discussion earlier this year. Here I want to stress that the Eno Center for Transportation does not lobby and takes no position on any specific legislation. Third is that there have been interesting and relevant developments overseas, particularly in Canada and Australia, that provide important lessons for ATC reform here in the United States. So for all those reasons, we updated this report. We're putting it out today. And so let me turn it over to Rui, who will walk through all this in more detail, focusing specifically on why all this matters today. And after that, we will take your questions via the comment feature on the webinar website. So with that, take it away, Rui.
Thank you, Rob. So this is Rene. I'm a policy analyst here at Eno and one of the co-authors of this report. So today I intend to go through these 5 recommendations, for reform arguments that you see on your screen for those who are following the webinar on the computer. So the first one is that the separation of air traffic control provision from its safety regulation is a very important point. The United States is one of the few remaining developed countries that keeps those two functions in-house under the same department, and that creates an issue of conflict of interest. It also goes against international standards the ICAO has put forward for over 15 years, recommending that separation. So this is a very important safety issue that should be addressed. The other issue is that air traffic controllers are very gung-ho for this reform. They've been supporting it wholeheartedly. And we know that controllers are the people running the system. They are ensuring the safety of the system. And when we hear them saying that it's very difficult to operate in this government bureaucracy with the government shutdowns, budget sequesters, and just a few weeks ago, the hiring freezes that is affecting air traffic controllers. It really makes a case for this sort of reform. This goes on to our third point, that this kind of reform, separating air traffic control from the FAA into either a government corporation or a non-profit entity, will shield air traffic control from this political instability. We know that these events, government shutdowns, and hiring freezes are not aimed at air traffic control, but they for sure affect how it is deployed. And this leads to instability in the system. It delays modernization. It delays the hiring and training of new controllers. So the long-term health of the system is put in jeopardy by all these political events. With such an independent system like we propose, the system will not be only shielded from this kind of political instability, it will have the budget and management stability to think longer term. The FAA is beholden to the bureaucracy that it's part of. They rely on congressional appropriations every year. They do not have a capital budget. They cannot issue bonds. So their modernization efforts are subjected to these constraints. Their federal procurement rules also impact how they can deploy new systems. So with an independent system operating like a commercial business with bonding capabilities, being able to charge user fees to its customers, the commercial airlines, it's very important. User fees are not the boogie monster that some try to say it is. It's completely normal for a utility, which at the end it's what air traffic control is, to charge those user fees. For example, everyone of you listening pays your electricity provider for the electricity that you use, and this is a similar system. In the report, we mentioned some examples of potential levels of user fees. For example, in Canada, a 500-mile flight would pay roughly $600 in user fees. So that's the level of the user fees that we are talking about. And finally, given the political environment that we live in, with all the focus on infrastructure investment, this is bipartisan infrastructure investment that won't cost a dime for taxpayers, that is achievable, is politically feasible, and is supported by many stakeholders all across the board. So it's reform that we should pursue. It's good public policy regardless of congressional or the administration. It's bipartisan. It has been proposed by many for the last 4 decades. The first proposals were in the 1970s to do something like this. So this is the time to act. Rob? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rui. So I want to close this part of the presentation by pointing out that we recognize the myriad issues that still need to be wrestled with, but we do believe that this is the right time for reform. We know that there is a national narrative about infrastructure, and that clearly matters today to the health and competitiveness of the country. We do know that today ATC reform is potentially a bipartisan issue. This has been discussed in administrations in the past. It's potentially bipartisan here in the future. And while it's complicated, it's not a $1 trillion proposal, nor does it require something as complicated as repatriation to get done. In the end, we do believe that this is probably the most significant reform in aviation governance that we can achieve in the last generation. So let me just turn it over to questions. I would encourage you all, people have already submitted some of those, go to the questions link on the webinar website. Go ahead and submit your questions, and we're going to start off with one that we have here for Jeff Davis, actually. The question is that a recent CBO report says that we can't spin off ATC as we propose because of the scoring issue for the congressional budget. Can you describe what the scoring issue means and how the Eno report addresses that?
Thank you. Well, there's 2 separate issues relating to the scoring of Chairman Schuster's bill from the last Congress. One is just that a committee jurisdictional thing, is that this legislation would have to have three separate parts: one from the Transportation Committee, one from the Ways and Means Committee, and one from the Budget Committee, because T&I creates the new corporation. Ways and Means has to lower the existing taxes to some extent, so they're replaced with user fees, and the Budget Committee has to move money from the discretionary, reduce the caps on discretionary spending account. So each individual piece will have a bad budget score, but when you put all three together, it can be done in a budget neutral way. The larger issue is more conceptual. Last year, when scoring the Schuster bill, CBO, relying on the 1967 Budget Concepts Commission report, said that because air traffic control is a natural monopoly and this non-government entity would have a role in collecting fees and operating this monopoly, it's still an inherently governmental function, so it should have to be scored as part of the government, regardless of the fact that the government specifically does not own or operate the corporation. This is one of those judgment calls that you get into periodically that's not set in stone, and you can go either way. CBO quoted one line from the Concept Commission report in its score supporting their point of view. There are other things. The Concept Commission also said that you have to ask questions like, quote, who owns the agency? Who supplies its capital? Who selects its managers? Do the Congress and the President have control over the agency's program and budget, or the agency's policies the responsibility of the Congress or the President only in some broad, ultimate sense? So, you know, legitimate people can disagree on this. The example is the way the budget treats Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac ever since the conservatorship happened in 2008. CBO scores them as part of the federal budget. The White House Office of Management of Budget does not. So every budget since 2008, CBO completely disagrees with the way the actual budget is presented. So it's very possible. I don't think OMB came out with a position one way or the other on how they would rule on this on the Schuster bill last year. But if OMB takes a position consistent with what they've done with Fannie and Freddie, then they would disagree, in which case the CBO issue becomes a political problem inside Capitol Hill. But if you can get the bill passed, it doesn't make a substantive problem at all, because the whole point of this exercise, going back to when Senators Inouye and Stevens proposed it in 1987, was to insulate air traffic control from federal budget pressures and sequestration and budget caps and deficits and all that. And the Supreme Court has conclusively ruled that in making these judgment calls, it's OMB and not CBO who gets to decide what accounts are subject to sequestration and which ones are not. So, if you know, the CBO's citing of this concept can be problematic from a political point of view inside Congress, but once if you get the legislation enacted somehow, it wouldn't matter at all.
Thanks very much, Jeff. It's clearly a complicated issue, but that's a clear answer we're going to get. So next question, there's been a lot of commentary out there that DOD, the Department of Defense, will be negatively impacted by ATC reform. So Rui, what are your thoughts on DOD, the Department of Defense, and ATC reform? Well,
it's true that there has been a lot of comments saying that they will be negatively impacted, but we haven't heard anything from DOD itself. So it's just a guessing game until they come out with an answer on their own. What we know is that they are a major player in air traffic control. They control around 15% of the U.S. airspace, plus a few dozen airports where they provide air traffic control services. Some of those have commercial civilian service as well. But we do know from experiences across the world that the relationship between civilian and military providers is completely feasible. Many countries operate their systems combined. Canada has a non-profit system, and they have a perfect relationship with their Ministry of Defense. So we don't foresee a problem. And until DOD comes out with a position one way or another, this is just really a guessing game.
So next question, Rui. So what happens to the existing assets that currently belong then to the FAA? Are they going to be sold or given away to this new entity?
Well, the assets should be transferred in their entirety to the new corporation or government corporation or nonprofit. Chairman Schuster's bill proposed that those assets would be transferred for free. Some people disagree with that because that would be meaning that we are transferring to a nonprofit entity assets that were paid by American taxpayers. In the end, it's very difficult to assess the value of those assets. These are hundreds and hundreds of FAA facilities across the nation. Many of those have long passed their useful life and need to be replaced and decommissioned. So valuing the assets in market valuation will be very difficult. What other countries have done, like Canada, it's all end up being a negotiation. In Canada, first, the government requested $5 billion for the transfer of assets. The new provider says, no way, we can't pay that, that's too expensive, and they ended up reaching a compromise of $1.5 billion. So I guess, I don't know if the free transfer of assets will play out that way. Probably there's going to be a negotiation, and we might end up having the new corporation paying something.
So by line, more of a negotiation than an accounting exercise.
Yes, totally.
So there are a couple of questions here about privatizing ATC and what it means to be a public-private partnership. So can you just describe a little more about how the initiative would be self-funded?
Yeah, so this will be a nonprofit entity governed by a number of stakeholders. For example, in Chairman Schuster's proposal, the board will be composed of people nominated by the airlines, by the air traffic controllers, by the pilots union, by general aviation, by business aviation, by the federal government itself, and this will be a self-governing entity funded by user fee charged to commercial airlines and cargo airlines. So every time a plane will depart from a U.S. airport, every time a plane flies in U.S. airspace, they would pay a fee. This is what has been done for many, many years across most of the nations. All of Europe, Canada, Japan, in many other nations, they've moved towards this model where instead of relying on taxation to fund their traffic control, they rely on user fees charged directly to the airspace users.
So there's a couple of questions here about NextGen specifically and about the challenges with that. So I guess generally, what is the problem with the FAA now, and why haven't they been able to get NextGen done, and why would our proposal do a better job of that?
Well, the big issue with FAA is that they are part of a government bureaucracy that has to deal with all the federal procurement rules, all the budget appropriations every year, so they cannot really plan long term because they do not know what the next budget will bring. They are subjected to expiring authorization, to government shutdowns, to budget sequesters. If we have a system that is separate from all of this, like Jeff talked about, the new entity will be able to have a capital budget. They'll be able to bond against future revenues. Those revenues will come from the user fees in the future, so they can really plan their modernization efforts in the long term. And whenever they need capital to do something, they do not have to wait for Congress to appropriate. They can just go to the capital markets. Their board will approve the investment, and then they will go to the capital markets, fund it, and have a rating in the market. NAV Canada, the Canadian provider, has AAA ratings with many entities, so it will be just another enterprise in the market.
That's great. And so a couple of questions leading off something that Jeff said and kind of the broad perspectives here about ATC as a monopoly. So does it need to be a monopoly permanently? I guess the general question is how do you introduce market questions in here, market?
It's really difficult for not to be a natural monopoly. It will be, I think it's conceivable that we have several providers competing to provide air traffic control services in the U.S., but the practical reality is that it's probably very, very difficult to do so. On the airport level, some countries have introduced some market realities. We have something similar in here with the contract tower program, or the FAA contracts out 250 something small airport towers, and they grant those concessions to 3 different providers. So at the airport level, it's easier to introduce market forces. At the en-route level between airports, it's more complicated. So it tends to be a natural monopoly.
So the big opposition here, part of the opposition comes from general aviation. Can you address how general aviation, what their concerns are, and if there's a way to get around their opposition to this?
Traditionally, they're being concerned over the decades is that they will reform will be a stepping stone for them having to pay user fees on a flight-by-flight level. To address those, on Chairman Schuster's proposal, Peace and General Aviation is completely exempt from user fees, so to try to assuage those fears. But regardless of that, many in the general aviation community think that a stakeholder-dominant system will lead to problems with access to airspace, like trying to curb access for general aviation pilots to portions of the airspace. That fear has not really played out in other countries that have a much smaller and much less vocal general aviation community. So it's really hard to see how such events could happen in the future. So,
but general aviation is the main stumbling block here, or at least part of the main stumbling.
Yes, they've been the most vocal against it.
So if this should come to pass, then what happens during the transition period? Thinking especially here about what would happen to the employees that are currently at the FAA. How long does that transition take, and what happens to those workers?
Yeah, the transition is always a complicated issue because we are moving more than 30,000 employees out of the federal government. What Chairman Schuster proposed in his bill is to give a 3.5 years period of transition before the corporation took over air traffic control. This would allow management to come in, the contracts to be signed, the procedures to be fleshed out, user fees to be set and to be discussed, to have public comments on them, and to be approved by the relevant authorities, namely the Secretary of Transportation. On the employee level, what has been proposed is that the employees would transfer to the new entity. They would keep, but they would have an option of not to. If they did not want to be part of this new entity, they could remain at the federal government doing other functions. For those employees that transfer to the new entity, they will remain all their union rights. They would be able to choose if they want to keep their pensions with the government or if they want to transfer them to a new entity. So in terms of the employee rights, the bill that was last on the table really gave them a number of protections, and even Democrats acknowledge that.
So the example in the paper that we use, that Eno uses, really focuses on Canada as a detailed case study. Can you compare and contrast the Canadian system with the U.S. system and how the proposals are the same or what's different about them?
The proposals are very similar. They both propose a non-profit entity governed by stakeholders. The composition of the board is different. Canada gives more seats to the airlines in a proportional numbers. Canada also has a number of seats reserved for people totally outside of the aviation industry. But one important thing to note is that the airlines, for example, the Controllers Union, can nominate people to the board, but they cannot nominate their own employees. So, for example, in Canada, the airline trade association nominates former airline CEOs to NAV Canada's board. The Controllers Union nominates former union officials to the board. So there's a level of independence there, and those nominees have to work in the best interest of the system, not the best interest of whoever nominates them. But the proposals are very similar. They rely on user fees for funding. It allows them to go to capital markets. There's a high level of stakeholder involvement in the government, so the proposals are very, very similar. And if the new system in the U.S. comes to be as successful as the one in Canada, I think we are in good hands because they are 20 years old and they have received many praises from all around.
So the report focuses on FAA and their inability to get next gen done. What would happen to the FAA should this come to pass? What, does the FAA just disappear, or what functions do they?
No, not at all. The FAA would remain as an essential piece of the U.S. aviation industry. They are the safety regulator. They are very good at that. We have achieved a tremendous level of safety due in much part because of the FAA's work. And actually, by doing this removing air traffic control out of the FAA, it would allow them to focus on their core mission of providing safety oversight, instead of having this dual mandate of both providing air traffic control and regulating the entire aviation industry. They will be able to focus on that core mission of safety, which is a very important one and a very important government role. The FAA is also a grant-making entity. They provide grants for airport financing through the Airport Improvement Program, and that role will remain as well.
So the last question, there's a couple questions here about then the governing body for the new entity. Do you expect that airport operators in particular would have a representative on the governing board of the new organization?
I think the last proposal from Chairman Schuster of the market gave them a seat, as well as aerospace manufacturers. Those were the changes in the markup. So yes, they'll be represented. There's also, besides the board of governors, there's also a board of advisors that it's much broader and includes people like the Department of Defense as well. So at least at one level, they would be involved for sure.
That's great. So I really appreciate the questions that have come in. I encourage folks to continue to reach out to the team here at Eno with additional questions and comments. We're going to stay engaged with this issue over the next couple of weeks, couple of months. We have an event scheduled at the National Press Club here in Washington on March 21st. There'll be a series of other outreach activities and events, so I encourage you to pay attention to that. So again, I want to thank you all for your participation in this call today. As I mentioned, this report was informed by the experts on our aviation working group. If you would like more information about that group, including how to join, you can drop an email to us at publicaffairs@eno.org, or feel free to just contact any of us. We can get you the right information. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly. It's an invaluable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice, not just including aviation, but clearly related to aviation. So once again, I want to thank you all for your participation, and have a great afternoon.